Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge. A moment comes, which comes but rarely in history, when we step out from the old to the new. It is fitting that at this solemn moment we take the pledge of dedication to the service of India and her people and to the still larger cause of humanity.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India Colonized. I'm your host Omar Haq. Today I'm proud to present to you our Guftagu with Professor of Religious Studies Dr Sher Ali Tareen. Guftagu is a series of interviews with authors and scholars of the subcontinent's history, where we discuss their work and its relevance in understanding today's world. We also discuss their journey to becoming a scholar of their own respective field. Dr. Sher Ali has been teaching at Franklin and Marshall College since 2012. He received his doctorate degree in Islamic Studies from Duke University and his bachelor's degree at Lancaster College. His work centers around Muslim intellectual thought in modern South Asia with a focus on intra-Muslim debates and polemics on crucial questions of law, ethics, and theology. His book, Defending Muhammed in Modernity, was published in 2019 as paperback from the University of Notre Dame Press and was awarded the American Institute of Pakistan Studies 2020 Book Prize. This book presents the most comprehensive and theoretically engaged work to date on what is arguably the most long-running, complex, and contentious dispute in modern Islam, the Barelvī-Deobandī polemic. The Barelvī and Deobandī groups are two normative orientations, reform movements, with beginnings in colonial South Asia, almost 200 years separate from the beginning of this polemic from the present. Its specter, however, continues to haunt the religious sensibilities of post-colonial South Asian Muslims in profound ways, both in the region and in the diaspora communities across the world. His book Defending Muhammed in Modernity challenges the commonplace tendency to view such moments of intra-Muslim contest through the prism of problematic yet powerful liberal secular binaries like legal, mystical, moderate or feminist, and reformist/traditionalist. Tareen argues that the Barelvī-Deobandī polemic was instead animated by what he calls competing political theologies that articulated during a moment in Indian Muslim history marked by the loss and crisis of political sovereignty. Based on the close reading of previously unexplored print and manuscript sources in Arabic, Persian, and Urdu, spanning the late 18th century and the entirety of 19th century, this book intervenes and integrates the often disparate fields of religious studies, Islamic studies, South Asian studies, critical secularism studies, and political theology. Dr. Tareen also co-hosts the popular podcast New Books in Islamic Studies that operates online through New Books Network and features interviews with authors of important new books in the broader field of Islamic studies. Check out the link below to access this wonderful resource. Here is our conversation with Dr. Sher Ali Tareen discussing his intellectual journey, the journey of writing this manuscript, and indulging with him on how we can engage with his work in the contemporary world and why it is still relevant for us to understand his work in today's world. Hello and welcome to India Colonized. It's a pleasure having you, Dr. Sher Ali Tareen. So before we start discussing about your absolutely engaging book, Defending Muhammed in Modernity, I just wanted to know a bit about yourself, your career and your intellectual journey, mostly about who are the people who influenced you or the books that influenced you, that brought you to where you are right now.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Omar, for inviting me to this excellent new podcast that you have put together. I think it's a really great idea to have a podcast focused on a specific theme, but that is also a very expansive theme that can generate a conversation among different kinds of scholars in South Asian studies and in different disciplines. So I think this is an excellent idea, and I wish you all the best for it. And thanks again for inviting me here. So, in some ways, I think your question connects to the kind of book that I ended up writing, Defending Muhammed and Modernity, whereby the aspiration really is to have a conversation that brings together scholars of South Asian studies, religious studies, Islamic studies, and what I might call critical secularism studies, as has been primarily, though not exclusively, has emerged from the discipline of anthropology. So to answer your question, the kinds of intellectual interests that have informed my work and my scholarship also come from these different intellectual universes, so to say. Critical secularism studies, of course, the work of Talal Asad and Sabah Mahmood in trying to rethink the alleged and often assumed separation and opposition between the religious and the secular. That whole literature, that whole conversation has been very influential to my work, as this book also testifies. Then, within the field of South Asian Islam, of course, the work of someone like Muhammad Qasim Zaman, made possible for younger scholars like myself to do this kind of work in modern South Asian Islam, really paved the way for close readings of the ulama, Muslim scholarly traditions in South Asia. My own advisor, of course, Ibrahim Musa, and other people in the Duke UNC area, Dr. Bruce Lawrence, Carl Ernst, etc. And of course, Dr. David Gilmart and Anna Bigelow, I should also mention here, among others. And of course, South Asian studies itself has been a very important part of my intellectual journey. Various historians like Professor Margaret Pernau, I mentioned David Gilmartin here, and even I should mention, some scholars whom I critique in this book have also been quite foundational and formative for me. Professor Barbara Metcalfe's work has been very formative and influential, even though I am a bit critical of some of her larger arguments in this book. So that's what I would say. Scholars of South Asian studies, Islamic studies, critical secularism studies, these are the different kinds of intellectual sort of streams that have informed my intellectual identity. And I really would like to think of myself as someone who operates at the intersection of these different fields that oftentimes don't talk to each other as much as they perhaps should. The other field I should mention is sort of more classical Islamic studies, is also very critical to my intellectual formation. Scholars like Johann Friedman and Dr. Jonathan Brown, Ahmad Shamsi, etc. Fazlur Rahman, of course. What I've tried to show in this book also is that the classical Islamic tradition is very critical to be able to understand the modern transformations that have come about in modern South Asia. So the pre-modern and the modern has to be in constant conversation with each other. I'll stop there.
So that's definitely a wide spectrum of disciplines that you have engaged in. So what actually led you to studying religion, religious studies, and especially religion in South Asia?
Sure. In undergraduate, and when I was doing my bachelor's degree at Macalester College in Minnesota, here in the US, I had just come from Pakistan. I'm originally from Pakistan, from Quetta in Pakistan. Like many international students, and I don't mean to stereotype here, but many South Asian students who come to the West, I was an economics major without much of an understanding of the humanities, especially not religious studies or philosophy, etc. It was a class on Indian philosophies that got me excited about the humanities. I still remember as a junior in college, meaning third year, I got very excited after reading Shankara and the whole Advaita Vedanta school and Nagarjuna, and in this kind of a precocious excitement about ideas like emptiness and the emptiness of emptiness, etc. These were very new ideas for me. The idea of the humanities and these philosophical questions of identity, etc. Now that I think back, I can understand why to a 19-year-old they would be quite striking. So that's when I actually got into the humanities, to be honest, through Indian philosophy, etc. That I took a class with Joy Lane, who's a philosopher of South Asia. And then, when I applied to graduate school, I realized that, perhaps South Asian Islam would be a field that I might be able to more thrive in and prepare myself for. So, I very coincidentally applied to Duke and UNC without really knowing much about what graduate school is or what it entails. So it was really a lot of serendipity that led me to go to graduate school, and I had no idea about what it will entail, and certainly had no idea about ulama traditions in South Asia whatsoever. I sort of had to learn what I would call Islamic Urdu, essentially from scratch. But it was an excellent journey, and of course, Arabic and Persian I had to pick up as well. So yeah, that's basically how the journey began, my intellectual path.
So a little of the number of questions that I have, I just want to know about your engagement with multiple languages like Persian, Urdu, and Arabic. How was it learning, and what did you feel? How did you feel that it opened up a wide range
Yeah.
of resources for you than maybe if you wouldn't have had learned those languages?
Yeah. Yeah, in some ways, the philological aspect is quite critical. In fact, also to the argument of the book and to the kind of intervention that it tries to make. And it also is critical to how I got to this topic and how I became interested in this topic. As I began to read some of these ulama texts, in the beginning it was primarily these reverential texts, or what are called malfuzat, where disciples of a particular scholar record and preserve the sayings and the stories of their masters, etc. So they're not that dense or challenging as texts. But even when I was reading that in my early months, I should say, not years, in graduate school, I just had this kind of a realization and almost an affective response of how interesting this discursive universe was, and how unaware I had been of it until this point. So that was this kind of a pause moment of, supposedly, I'm from South Asia, grew up there till the age of 18, then moved to the US for my education, etc. But this tradition seemed so foreign to me, and that actually led me to some kind of self-questioning of why was it seeming so foreign. And that made me sort of realize the kind of atrocity and the kind of psychological damage that this three-tiered education system in these post-colonial societies like Pakistan is. This English sort of medium schooling, and then of course you have the sort of public schooling in Urdu, and then of course the madrasas or the religious seminaries, etc. So it got me thinking about this very interesting and intriguing tradition that was this kind of an internal other, which was in my supposed national language, but that seemed quite different and quite challenging. So anyway, so that got me determined to really try to get a handle of this, and got me curious. And then I realized that in order to be able to really get into the depth of these discourses and their traditions, etc., one has to be able to go prior to the modern moment and to look at the kind of the black box, the kind of the sources of the tradition that these scholars imbibe and then they articulate in the modern moment. And for that, you need to, of course, get into the Muslim legal tradition, the Muslim theological tradition, the Quran commentary tradition, etc. And for that, of course, really devoting yourself to Arabic becomes absolutely critical. But at the same time, these scholars also wrote, especially in the early 19th century, in Persian. So, in fact, I was just looking over the book in this preparation for this conversation, because it's been a while since it got published, and I don't remember it as well as I did when I wrote it. So I realized the first part of the whole book is actually based primarily on Persian sources, which is quite interesting to think about. That these scholars also, Persian was a very important part of their lingua franca, at least until the early 19th century and even beyond. So you need to really have that under your belt as well. And the three languages, when you do them together, they reinforce each other. So that is what happened. And I would say that, as far as graduate school is concerned, among other things, the philological sort of training and sort of exertion and striving was perhaps the most enjoyable aspect. And that, I think, is here I would sort of play slightly partisan, as much as I would like to think of myself as an interdisciplinary scholar who draws on different disciplines of history, anthropology, etc. But that for me is why religious studies, a certain kind of a textual religious studies, is an important part of my identity. that was thoroughly enjoyable, and that's become a very important part of who I am as a person as well. But it requires sustained striving, but it really does give you good rewards in being able to navigate a multiple range of sources from the modern and the pre-modern eras in a manner which does justice, hopefully does justice to the complexity of the thought of these scholars.
That's wonderful. But before we can actually start discussing about the journey of you writing this book, I wanted to know what advice you would give to, say, prospective students of religious studies or people who want to study religion in South Asia. What do you think are some of the skills that you would suggest that
Yeah.
they imbibe early on while starting to beginning to explore the field?
Yeah, I think it's very important to a few things I would say. Let's make it more focused on, say, South Asian Islam, because South Asian religion then becomes a much wider category that I don't have the expertise to speak about. So I think it's very important. I think one of the most exciting things to be working on South Asian Islam is that one can draw on multiple fields and multiple kinds of scholars and approaches. That is what makes it exciting, and that is also what makes it challenging. So on the one hand, one is in conversation with sort of classical Islamic studies in terms of the pre-modern tradition and the different intellectual traditions within Islam. So there is that whole universe. Then, of course, there is the more sort of slightly more theoretically charged universe of South Asian studies with these questions of colonialism and is it a rupture or a continuity, and the kind of back and forth on these kinds of questions, how to sort of theorize and think about questions of caste and the nation state and so on and so forth, which of course is a very profitable sort of discussion. Though oftentimes in South Asian studies itself, I mean, although it's a very diverse field, there does seem to be a certain kind of a reluctance to engage with religion or to take religion seriously on its own terms. There is a certain kind of a secularity that is sort of under the sort of that somewhat pervades the field without it being very obvious often, but still it's a very important field to engage with. And then, of course, there is what one might call sort of, for lack of a better term, post-colonial thought, or questions of thinking critically about categories like the secular tradition, modernity, etc., that one can draw from anthropology and other disciplines. So my advice would be to think widely and to not feel the pressure of getting defensive about the particularity of one's own field. I think it's important to sort of cast the net widely and to sort of enjoy the process of bringing these different things into conversation, and to take intellectual risks at some point. And so for example, we'll come to the book in a moment, but the main argument of this book, of looking at the Barelvī-Deobandī polemic as a reflection of competing political theologies, it's an intellectual risk that I took in making that argument. Some people might agree with it, some people may not. I could have done something slightly more conventional, but I think it's important to bring these different sort of intellectual disciplines into conversation, and then to try to be able to say new things and try to sort of be able to venture into new kinds of archives. So there are these incredible scholars whose thought is crying out for more attention. Anwar Shah Kashmiri, Abdul Hayy Lakhnawi, etc., many others as well. So I would say, at the risk of using a cricketing metaphor, play on the front foot. Be more sort of creative and don't feel defensive about the particularity or the specificity of one's very limited field. Take risks, take intellectual risks, put these different things into conversation, then see what comes out of it. I think that's what I would recommend. And the other thing I would say is really philological rigor is very, very critical. I would not be one of those who would sort of make any kind of boundary markings about what counts as Islamic studies and what counts as religious studies or not. That's none of my business, and it should not be anyone's business. That's just impolite kind of boundary marking of a particular field. Having said that, I would say that if one is invested in the textual traditions of South Asian Islam, the different ways in which one can study South Asian Islam ethnographically, anthropologically, different sort of through its literature, etc. So there are different sort of avenues. South Asian Islam should be taken as a very capacious category. But if one is interested in the textual ulama traditions of South Asia, then I really think, whether the modern period or the pre-modern period, then I really think it is critical to be able to go back and forth between Arabic, Persian, and Urdu at least, with some degree of fluency. I think that kind of philological striving becomes very critical. So and to enjoy that process again, to really enjoy that process, and not to see that as a burden, but as something, as a challenge to relish, is how I would put it. So I think the mindset has to be one of enjoying these challenges rather than being too defensive about mastering the specific particularity of one's field, because that pressure, it tends to really dominate graduate school for no good reason, to really, have some kind of a mastery over a field, and one feels this kind of pressure for no good reason. I think that's a very problematic and non-beneficial attitude. The more one enjoys the process of learning, it sounds a bit cliche, but it is true. The more I think one actually learns and contributes to a field with confidence, but also with humility. I think the two have to go together.
So passion and determination are key to
and always to be humble and realize there is so much more to be done, and there are so many great scholars out there that you have to give your own modest contribution and then see what people say.
That's good. So to coming to the journey of you writing this book, so what were some of the hindrances that you found while doing this project, or how were you able to access these books, and what were some of the benefits of your skills that you had while you were accessing these books or sources for this project?
Yeah. Well, in some ways, I think I was fortunate in that when it comes to the religious thought of many of these actors, I mean, there is, of course, great scholarship that has been done, but sort of to do this kind of close readings of many of these texts, that's something that is what I found missing in the field. I mean, there were some excellent institutional histories, some readings of texts here and there as well, but this kind of close reading and putting these different kind of texts in Arabic, Persian, Urdu into conversation with each other was something that had not been attempted with this kind of detail before. So when you're doing something new like that, it can be a challenge, but it can also be something quite exciting. So I was very lucky to have done quite a bit of my research at the Punjab University Library in Lahore, which for any aspiring researcher in the field of South Asian Islam is a place I would highly recommend. It has some excellent untapped manuscript resources in all languages, but especially in Persian, that have not been looked at as much as scholars should or could. I also really benefited from the Ganj Bakhsh Library in Islamabad that houses Persian sources from South Asia and elsewhere. So those two places were really critical to accessing some less known sources. Like, for instance, in one of the chapters, I talk about the eyewitness account of someone who went on this jihad movement against the Sikhs in what is today the frontier region, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province today, but at that time the frontier region. So this person who goes and comes back and writes an eyewitness account of this jihad movement against the Sikhs, how it had gone wrong, etc. So that manuscript I was able to access at Punjab University Library, for example, Tarikh al-Aimma. So yeah, but since this topic deals with the late 18th and the entirety of the 19th century, there are pretty good sources which are available in print as well. But to get to the manuscript sources, I think these two locations in Lahore and Islamabad, the Ganj Bakhsh Library and the Punjab University Library, were very crucial. And I should actually really thank the staff there for making that possible. And I should also thank, now that I'm acknowledging, the American Institute of Pakistan Studies, who extended a very generous fellowship that allowed me to go and spend considerable time in Lahore and Islamabad. Unfortunately, I was not able to travel to India as part of this research. I have gone to India personally, but as part of this research. But I think that also is very, very important to bring, sources in India, Pakistan, and elsewhere. It's called British Library is very critical as well, into conversation with each other. But yeah, there are all these untapped manuscripts that are out there. If we think that we enjoy an in-depth knowledge of this tradition, we are deeply mistaken. There is a lot out there that needs to be looked at, especially when it comes to manuscript resources, and especially in Arabic and Persian.
So, during your visit in India, did you ever get to visit Barelvī or Deobandī while you were there personally in India? Did you ever get to come to those cities?
I visited India a long, long time ago. In fact, as a young adult, when I was not a scholar, I really wish to go to India, of course, now that I've focused on, my topic is 19th century North India. So I took a train. This was back in the day. It still exists, maybe. I'm not sure in what form. There was this thing called the Pakistan India People's Peace Forum. So I was one of the young delegates of that. And one year you would have a delegation from India come to Pakistan, the next year from Pakistan to India. So we actually took a train from Amritsar to Calcutta, the Howrah Mail, I believe it was called. So that actually did pass through North India, and I have very vivid recollection of passing through Bareilly, etc. So little did I know that 25 years or so later, I would write, or even more, I guess, years later, I would be writing a book that is centered on that region. I just remember it being really, really beautiful, especially the sort of fields of Uttar Pradesh as we passed through that. But at that moment, religious studies or these traditions was something that I had no knowledge at all about. I remember being much more invested in the cricket score of India versus South Africa. This was January 1997. When India was touring South Africa, and I would get out at each station and ask people what is the score, thing that, as if everyone would know what the score is, and people would just look at me, what this person is saying. So no, I had no idea, but I really do wish to go back and of course spend time. I'm in touch with scholars from there, ulama from North India, from different schools, but I wish to definitely visit back.
Oh, that's really nice. So, for the sake of our audience, could you briefly and plainly describe the themes of your book in the project? What exactly your book covers?
Yeah. So primarily, the time period that it focuses on is the late 18th and the entirety of the 19th century, and it talks about these two competing groups of extremely influential, prolific, and arguably sort of the most influential and prolific groups of scholars in modern South Asia. And the book details an intra-Muslim debate, which often took the form of a polemic, that began as a debate between different individual scholars in the early 19th century, and then took on a much more group-centered orientation by the late 19th century. And this debate, my argument is that it primarily dealt with the question of how should one understand divine sovereignty and its relationship to Prophet Muhammad's authority and charisma, and then the everyday ritual practice of the masses, the Indian Muslim public. How should one understand this relationship, divine sovereignty, prophetic authority, everyday ritual practice, in conditions when Muslims had lost their political sovereignty? So these two groups are called the Barelvīs and the Deobandīs, named after these two towns, Deoband and Bareilly, in northern India. Both of these groups of scholars are from the Hanafi school of law, that of course dominates South Asia. And of course, are major Sufi masters as well. The Barelvi is more attached to the Qadri order, the Deobandi is more the Chishti Sabri order. And in the early 19th century, the kinds of questions that these scholars debated in the late 19th century, they were also debated in the early 19th century by these two very influential individual scholars called Shah Muhammad Ismail, who was the grandson of the much esteemed and heralded Shah Waliullah, died 1762, and Shah Muhammad Ismail died in 1831. And another scholar called Fazl Khairabadi, died 1861, who also is a preeminent scholar, especially known for his works on logic and philosophy, etc. So the whole book is about detailing, in some depth and detail, I hope, the competing positions of these two groups of scholars on questions of theology, law, and ritual practice. And by doing so, try to disrupt a very common understanding of this polemic, a very common notion or way that this polemic is often understood in both academic and non-academic circles, as one between Islamic law and Sufism. So oftentimes, the Deoband scholars and their predecessor, Shah Muhammad Ismail, they're oftentimes understood as these very harsh, sort of Sharia-minded conservatives who opposed all kinds of ritual practices that had to do with venerating the Prophet, primarily, the celebration of his birthday and other rituals. Whereas the other group of scholars, the Barelvī school, who defended such rituals and defended a certain vision of Prophet Muhammad as the most beloved of God's creation in modernity, are oftentimes presented as this kind of soft Sufi mystics who are the kind of good kind of Muslims, so to say. So I was trying to disrupt this kind of a binary framing. And through that, I was trying to disrupt this larger good Muslim, bad Muslim discourse that pervades especially neo-imperial think tanks in places like Washington, D.C., etc. So I was trying to complicate this intra-Muslim debate by giving a voice to its actors. And by doing that, I was trying to make a case that the complexity of their thought is such that it brings into question the liberal secular promise, the liberal secular attempt and striving at boxing religion and religious actors into binaries like legal, mystical, good Muslim, bad Muslim, traditional, modern, so on and so forth. So through that, what I try to do is try to question and challenge the inevitability and the operations of liberal secular power. So it is through that I contribute to critical secularism studies, but not through sort of a genealogy of secular power per se, as has been done by anthropologists like Talal Asad, Sabah Mahmood, and others, but through a close reading of the tradition. And through that, I've tried to bring together the study of Islam, the study of South Asia, and the study of critical secularism studies. So that, in some ways, would be a short synopsis of this book.
That's wonderful. So, what made you choose the title for your book as Defending Muhammed in Modernity?
Sure. So that's a great question. So in many ways, as I was researching this book, I realized that many of the questions that these actors are contesting. So, for example, the Prophet's intercession on behalf of sinners on the Day of Judgment, or the question of heretical innovation, or bid'ah as it is called, which basically means new practices, new kinds of rituals and beliefs that oppose the prophetic norm. So innovating in the Prophet's norm in a way that challenges it, that basically is heretical innovation. That again centers on the Prophet. Or the question of the Prophet's knowledge of the unknown, ilmul ghaib, things that are unknown to anyone except God. What does the Prophet have that knowledge? If yes, what kind? How does he get it? All these theological questions, again centered on the Prophet. Can God create a second Muhammad or not? What is called Imkan and Nadir. So I realized that all these questions in some ways gravitate and center on Muhammad, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So why is that the case? And what I realized is that the reason why that is the case is as Indian Muslims become colonized, connecting to the title and the topic of your podcast here, as South Asian Muslims become colonized and lose their political sovereignty, they become ever more eager, anxious, and invested in proffering particular visions of how one should understand Prophet Muhammad in conditions of modernity. And their conceptions of ideal notions of Prophet Muhammad corresponded with their ideal notions of an Indian Muslim individual and an Indian Muslim public, or what one might call a moral individual and a moral public that they imagined in conditions of modernity. So these competing groups of scholars, whom at one point in the book I call all the Prophet's Indian men, they eagerly debated each other's positions, but one thing they had in common, one thing they agreed on, is that we ought to aggressively debate and secure and preserve a certain conception of Muhammad in modernity. And that's basically Muhammad became the hermeneutical or interpretive key through which they imagined the work of religious reform, through which they imagined what a moral individual in public should look like in conditions of modernity. So Muhammad, in some ways, the body of the Prophet, the physical body as well as a symbolic body, became a synecdoche, or stood in for a larger conception of an Indian Muslim individual and public in conditions of modernity. So that's basically the idea, defending Muhammad in modernity, how competing conceptions of Muhammad were contested and defended in these new conditions when Indian Muslims had lost their political sovereignty. So in some ways, the point is that Muhammad becomes a synecdoche for sovereign power. In the absence of the state, in the absence of political sovereignty, it is the conception of Muhammad and how he should manifest in the everyday lives of Indian Muslims and how his relationship to God should be understood. Again, that's a relationship that is the conceptual thread binding the book between God, the prophet, and the community. Divine sovereignty, prophetic authority, everyday ritual life, this triumvirate relationship. So that conception of normative Muhammad basically is a synecdoche for sovereign power. So that basically is how it is connected to the argument of the book as well, about competing political theologies or competing notions of Muhammadan modernity.
So could we say, because there was no, the Muslims were losing their sovereignty, and because of which the theologians, or basically the ulama, wanted to reign certain control over the community, is that because of which these kind of arguments and contestations actually began?
So there are a few different aspects to that. And a couple of I think your question is excellent because it allows me to clarify a couple of things as well. So with political theology, I'm not making a causative argument per se, and neither am I making a historicist argument. It is a historical argument, but not a historicist argument. In that, political theology as a category really tries to capture the synchronicity between theological discourses and political conditions and transformations, especially in these hinge moments like early and late 19th century South Asia, as a community transitions from an earlier political order into a new sort of political order, which shares certain features with the earlier political order as well, as I show in chapter 1 of this book. But that also is radically quite different, the British colonial state and the Mughal state. So that's the first one I would make. It's not a causative argument per se, but it is about how in theological discourses invested in how one should imagine God, the prophet, and the community, there are competing visions of politics that are embedded in these theological discourses. So it's not causative, but it is showing the synchronicity between theology and politics per se. So for example, if there are a group of scholars who are trying to present a notion of Prophet Muhammad that emphasizes his humanity, his subservience to the divine sovereign, and through that they critique ritual practices like celebrating the prophet's birthday, others, etc., who are basically critiquing hierarchies, spiritual hierarchies when it comes to the relationship between God, the prophet, and the community, by presenting a more human Muhammad. And other scholars then present and contest this notion to say that no, actually divine sovereignty and the prophet's charisma as the most exceptional, as the most beloved of God's creation, Muhammad as the cosmic, central cosmic being, you have to maintain those hierarchies. You have to preserve those hierarchies. You can't eviscerate those hierarchies. So what I was interested in was that in the seemingly theological debate, what are the largest political imaginaries that are being articulated without them being spelled out as such? So without it being spelled out as a discourse on politics, nonetheless, theological discourses are always embedded in these larger political imaginaries. So that's what I was trying to do here. And through that, what I was trying to do was, in some ways, trying to, I guess, decolonize these days has become such a cliche word that I almost hesitate to use it. I was recently talking to Professor Salman Sayyed, who's one of the major scholars who has talked about decolonial studies and Islamic studies, who was sort of giving it a comparison that these days it's like a coffee cup at a Starbucks that everyone is now holding. Everyone is into decolonizing, but let me just still use this term. What I was really trying to do was decolonize the field of political theology somewhat, which has primarily been invested in the question of the theological foundations of the modern secular state. That has been the bread and butter of political theology as a field, following Carl Schmitt and the reinvention of Carl Schmitt and the sort of ways in which people have drawn on him more recently. What I was interested in was the question of the political imaginaries and understandings that are embedded in seemingly theological discourses, sort of invert the problem space of political theology somewhat, to be able to show that these Muslim scholars from South Asia, these ulama, can also contribute to the field of political theology, so sort of disrupt the West-centric ways in which political theology as a field has primarily been deployed in Western academic studies and the Western humanities. So it's not a causative argument, but certainly I think the when the question is asked, the historical question, why do these debates begin to take steam and really become very heated by the late 19th century? Why is it happening in this moment? Again, coming to the main topic of your podcast, why is it happening in the colonial moment? I think my answer to that why is precisely that the loss of Muslim political sovereignty creates the conditions that makes these kinds of debates that have a much older history, that makes them much more publicly contested, that makes them much more vociferously contested, that makes them much more proliferated in a much wider geographic and intellectual expanse. So that is the sort of moment, this loss of Muslim political sovereignty, that makes this kind of a debate and its intensity possible. The other thing I would say, and that's the last thing I would say in response to your question, is this debate is also made possible by the new conditions of colonial modernity. The printing press, of course, oftentimes people talk about it. That really makes it possible for these kinds of texts to be published and reach the kinds of audiences that it did. New technologies like the train and telegraph, etc., makes these kinds of debates possible. But at the same time, as maybe we'll come back to this, but very briefly, I would say another point that I do make in this book is that we cannot reduce these debates to the new conditions of colonial modernity either. They have a much longer history. They have a much longer sort of discursive tradition that they're a part of. So I am not in favor of collapsing or assimilating these debates to the conditions of colonial modernity either, while also really highlighting the critical significance and importance of the conditions of colonial modernity for making these debates possible in the first place. So I think both you have to balance a bit, not assimilate, but also highlight how these new conditions of colonial modernity make these debates possible.
Well, interesting. But also at the same time, you briefly mentioned about how you, through your work, try to deconstruct the binary that is often brought by Western authors while dealing with this area of study. So how exactly do you go about this in your project?
Thank you. Yeah, and I would mention that this binary, of course, has been deployed for very insidious purposes by, say, new imperial think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and the Rand is it corporation? Who wrote these papers after 9/11 saying that the Barelvis are the soft Sufis and peace-loving Sufis, and the Deobandis are the harsh Taliban-like Sharia-minded scholars, which really showed their ignorance of the terrain of South Asian Islam, and it led to some pretty insidious sort of funding campaigns and others, etc. That paradoxically, you can't reduce it to that, but paradoxically that has had the effect of making some Barelvi actors somewhat more extremist when it comes to prophetic love, and has led to all these kinds of problematic gestures and moves when it comes to preserving prophetic honor and in debates on blasphemy, etc. But to come to your main question here, how do I try to disrupt this binary then? By doing two things. One, by pointing out that very obvious fact that both of these scholars were legal scholars and major Sufi masters. And in fact, if someone were to critique this book in some ways, one part of their intellectual makeup that I don't spend much time on, really because I did not have the space to do that, and it would have made this project perhaps a lot messier and made its readability worse, is the Sufi writings and the role of these scholars as Sufi masters. Maulana SherAli Tareen of the Deoband school, who is a major protagonist of this book, of course, Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan, even Shah Muhammad Ismail, of course, has written some incredible Sufi texts like Abakat, which is commenting on a work of his grandfather, etc. So that's one very important point, that these are legal scholars and Sufi masters. So just that obvious fact erases this binary. Second, by really pointing out that, in Sufism, as any beginner student of Sufism would know, accessing divine reality, the haqiqa, and to be able to be on the Sufi path or tariqa requires that you follow the dictates of Sharia. So it's Sharia, tariqa, haqiqa, right? Sort of a progressive hierarchy. So there is no such thing as following the Sufi path without adhering to dictates of the law. So just by that front, this binary crumbles. But really the way I do that is by really going into the logic of their arguments in some depth. When they debate the question of the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, how do they do that? What is the logic at stake? When they debate things like, can one raise one's hand over food on the third day of someone's death or not, which might seem as an arcane squabble of an eccentric elite from the 19th century, but has some profound implications for how one thinks about the relationship between individual, society, and history and time, as I show in the book. Let me answer it very briefly. The way I do that is by really giving a voice to the complexity and the layers and the nuances of their thought, by going into their texts, by showing that if you actually look at their texts in some kind of a complex fashion, this debate has very little to do with some kind of a binary opposition between Sufism and law, which is not to say that some Deoband scholars did not critique excesses in Sufi practices. Certainly they did so, and even Ahmad Raza Khan did so. That's not the point, but the point being that reducing this kind of or framing this as a contestation between law and Sufism is really impoverished. And it's not only Western scholars, by the way, Western think tanks that do that. Even Muslims who are less familiar with this debate, that's the common idea that comes to their mind, that there's one group who is all for going to the shrines of saints, and another group that admonishes people for doing so. Things are much more complex than that, and this book really is an invitation to dive into that complexity.
I kind of held on to similar kind of ideas before I actually read the book, and it completely changed how I thought about these debates between the two, Barelvī and Deobandī polemic. So, continuing on that, could you tell us a bit to our audience about the Barelvī and Deobandī polemic, in quite briefly, for them to basically grapple with the ideas?
So in a nutshell, as I've mentioned already, there are these two competing, what I call, political theologies at work in this polemic. On the one hand, you have a group of scholars, the Deoband school, and then before that, Shah Muhammad Ismail in the early 19th century, who is a scholar who occupies the first part of this book, and his debate with Fazliha Khairabadi, who's from the Khairabadian school. For them, they saw the present in which they lived in as enveloped, as encircled by moral chaos and corruption. And for them, the reason for that was the way in which divine sovereignty had been compromised by the conduct of the Indian Muslim masses in their daily lives, especially in their ritual and devotional lives. Now, their argument was not that people have, become agnostic or atheists, so they don't realize that God is one. That was not their argument. Their argument was, and in fact, they would have said that if this was the case, that would actually have made their jobs much easier. To remind atheists of God is a job easier than people who actually thought that they were doing pious acts, people who thought that they were doing acts which were good in God's eyes, but in fact, they had been corrupted. And what made their actions corrupted in the view of the Deoband scholars was that they had elevated the Prophet in a manner that often undermined his humanity. And because of that, the radical separation and the radical alterity between the divine sovereign and the Prophet had been compromised. So they articulated an imaginary of the Prophet that emphasized above all else his humanity. And according to them, the perfection of the Prophet's humanity is what was the source of his perfection as a prophet. So they also have a conception of prophetic love. So this should also not be seen, and this perhaps is a point I could have made even clearer in the book, this should also not be seen as a debate between the protagonists of prophetic love and those who don't love the Prophet. No, the Deobandis also, of course, deeply, deeply love the Prophet. But for them, it is precisely in celebrating the Prophet's humanity that one shows one's adherence, one's allegiance to the Prophet. That is basically the way in which they thought about the relationship between divine sovereignty, prophetic authority, and everyday life. I'll give you an example in a moment. I'm just giving you the broad difference between these two schools, and then I'll give you an example which will make things clearer. For the Barelvī school and Fazliha Khairabadi, before the Barelvī school, and the founder of the Barelvī school, Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan, died 1921. For them, divine sovereignty and prophetic charisma or prophetic exceptionality, the status of the Prophet as the most exceptional, the most charismatic human, were not opposed. In fact, it is precisely by affirming one's allegiance to the Prophet as the most exceptional, as the most cosmically central being in the world, that one showed one's allegiance to the divine sovereign. So the two were not mutually exclusive or opposed, but in fact, they were mutually entangled. And from that, they also vigorously defended rituals that were meant to venerate the Prophet, that were meant to elevate the Prophet in the way that he should have. So that in some ways is the sort of broad differences. Having said that, when you actually look at their debates on particular ritual practices, so one of the ritual practices that I've spent perhaps the most time on in this book, which is the most debated practice among these two schools, was the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, that, as we know, has been happening since the 11th century of the Gregorian calendar, starting from Fatimid Egypt. It happens until today in all Muslim societies, including in South Asia, even today. So I'll just give you very, very briefly, and the details are in the book, but very, very briefly, the two opposing arguments of these two scholars. So for the Deoband scholars, and this is a point I make repeatedly in the book, they did not say that the Maulid, or the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, is some kind of a bad practice. Not at all. In fact, they said it is a commendable practice because it is meant to venerate the Prophet. Their problem was the manner in which the public, the masses, engage in this practice. Their point was that the manner in which they engage in this practice is undermining divine sovereignty and elevating the Prophet in a problematic fashion. Why? And they gave a few reasons for that. One was that, and the main sort of reason, the main sort of legal reasoning, the main sort of the logic behind their argument was that, as you would know, Umar, that in the Sharia, you have different kinds of practices. Some practices are obligatory, praying, fasting, etc. Some practices are forbidden, consumption of pork, alcohol, etc. And then there are these practices that are in the middle, which are neither obligatory nor forbidden, which are called simply permissible. So the Maulid is one of those practices which are neither forbidden nor obligatory. So the argument of the Deoband scholars was that the Muslim masses are engaging in this practice with such regularity, with such passion, with such discipline, that they have almost turned a simply permissible practice into an obligation. The category they use is that they have made this practice simulate obligatory practices, and that simulation is what they found problematic. And how did you know that they have turned it into an obligation? They proposed a very simple experiment. Say 1 year someone says, I'm not going to perform the Maulid, I'm not going to celebrate the Prophet's birthday. So their argument was that if someone does that in their neighborhood, other people would censure that person, would rebuke that person. How dare you not celebrate the Prophet's birthday? So their argument was that when abeyance, or when withholding from a simply permissible practice becomes the cause of your community's rebuke and censure, then you know that that community has turned it into an obligation. So the technical term that they use is turning into an obligation that which is not obligatory. Iltizam ma la yalzam. So that was their major argument. The other argument was that people engage in all kinds of corruption. They spend too much money on this kind of a ritual. They do it for affectation. Interestingly, they use some interesting sort of affective reasoning that people with good voices come here that can lead to sexual arousal and passions and desires, etc. The use of fragrances is too excessive, and so on and so forth. So their argument was that these corruptions have entered into the ritual as well. The opposing argument, the Barelvī school, again, like when I said with the Deoband school, it's not as if they said this was a bad ritual, but the way in which people are performing it has made it into a heretical innovation, a bid'ah, an innovation, a new practice which the Prophet and his companions did not perform in, that in their view was now opposing the prophetic norm, the Sunnah. The Barelvī school, Ahmad Raza Khan, for example, when it comes to this ritual, it's not as if that he was completely okay with whatever the masses did. He was also deeply critical of their practice. So this is not a debate between elitists and populists. These are both very elitist scholars who don't think very highly of the masses. They both use this category. The masses are like cattle. Al-awamu kal-an'amu. Al-awamu kal-anami. That the masses are like cattle. Ahmad Raza Khan's argument was that rather than calling this a heretical innovation, and rather than completely banning this ritual, what you should do is just remove the corruptions that have been attached to it. If someone is understanding this ritual as an obligation, talk to them, educate them, engage in moral pedagogy. If someone is spending too much money, then erase this corruption. Don't ban the ritual altogether. That was his main argument. And his other main argument, his main sort of the traditional logic that he used in making this point was that any practice that God has not expressly and explicitly forbidden in the Sharia, the default value is permissibility. So the Maulid, God has not called it forbidden. So who are the Deoband scholars to be calling it forbidden? So his main argument, he turned their argument on its head and said that when God has not called it forbidden and you're calling it forbidden, you are basically overriding God and you're trying to play God. So you are saying that you're trying to preserve divine sovereignty, but in fact, you are the ones who are contravening divine sovereignty, the sovereignty of God that is reflected in the law. So his argument was also based on legal reasoning. The default value of all practices is permissibility, and you cannot call it forbidden. If you call it forbidden, you are the ones contravening God's sovereignty, not those who support this ritual. So the point here being that notice that in this debate, I've given you a very, very one small example. There are many, many other examples and many other sort of layers of this argument. It's just the bare sort of minimum that I've presented here, which also took me at least 5 minutes to present. Both of these scholars are using their understandings of the Islamic legal tradition. Both of these scholars are grounding their arguments in the Islamic legal tradition. Ahmad Raza Khan, when he's trying to oppose the Deoband scholars, he argues that, look, scholars from across centuries, people like Sayyuti, others across centuries, had no problem with the Maulid. So who are you Indians scholars today to be calling it a heretical innovation? Ashraf Ali Thanvi responded to Ahmad Raza Khan by saying, if Sayyuti would have lived in India today, he also would have called this a heretical innovation. If they knew what the Indian Muslim masses are doing, they also would have called it heretical innovation. The point here being that both of these scholars are very invested in solidifying, in making their arguments credible, in making their arguments authoritative by citing precedents from the past, by grounding it in sound Islamic legal reasoning. These are two competing rationalities of tradition and reform. This is not a debate between Sufism and law per se, not between the mystical and the legal, not between populist and elitist, not between conservative and liberal, and so on and so forth. So to give you another, to answer your earlier question, this is how I try to disrupt this binary, by showing the precise logics of their argument. And this is just one example of how this debate unfolded.
So one of the interesting figures that appealed to me in the book was Shah Muhammad Ismail, and you talk about his engagements with the public, and while at the same time his engagements with exclusive circles and his exclusive engagements, and how it was different from what he used to advise to the public versus what he wrote, say, in Fussy Persian, per se, to his exclusive group. So if you could tell us a bit about, or give insight into that one figure of the book.
Thank you very much, Amit. And thank you so much for the very close reading of the book that you've done. I really, really appreciate it for your time. Shah Muhammad Ismail is a very critical figure of this book, who, as I said, occupies most of the first part of the book, and his debate with Fazl Kharabadi, who's also a very critical figure in this book. And I was precisely trying to disrupt this common stereotype that is often attached to Shah Muhammad Ismail as some kind of a Puritan figure, as someone who was deeply upset with these ritual practices in the 19th century and was just a shock and awe kind of a scholar who only wrote polemically and does not have this kind of intellectual density that, say, his grandfather might have had, or say later Deoband scholars might have had, etc. And the way I try to do that is, again, to bring to the fore the different variety of his writings. So, in a text like this one text called Energizing Faith or Fortifying Faith, Taqwiyatul Iman, his most famous book, published in 1825, which was written in a kind of vernacular Urdu. That book was very, very fierce. It was very polemical. It was written and intended for the masses, and hence it created such a furor that his sermons were banned in the Jama Masjid in Delhi, and he basically is seen in the historiography as someone who divided families in Delhi and North India on these questions, etc. So there is that Shah Muhammad Ismail. But then another text of his called Mansab-e-Imamat in Persian is written in exquisitely refined Persian, in fact, and it is a book on political theory. It's basically a book on different kinds of political leaders and leadership, and what is normatively permissible and what is not. And in that book, we see not a maximalist Shah Muhammad Ismail, like the one we see in Taqwiyatul Iman, but a more minimalist Shah Muhammad Ismail, who in fact is fine with even a morally corrupt ruler as long as the distinctive markers of Islam, what is called Sha'air-e-Islam, remain current in the public sphere. So again, it's a much more complex argument that I explore in chapter 4 of the book, is a reading of Mansab-e-Imamat. But that is his main point, that the distinctive markers of Islam in the public sphere have to remain current. And until they are, then he is okay with even a morally sluggish ruler, as long as he's not completely under the spell of unbelief, in which case, Muslims of that polity have to rebel against that ruler. So what I tried to show there was that, in fact, these might seem like, so what is the contradiction there? Someone might look at this and say, this is contradictory, these two kinds of views. But what I tried to show was that, in fact, both of these texts come together in an interesting way, and both of them make an argument for divine sovereignty. They just come from different places and emphasize different aspects of that argument. So both of these books are all about trying to preserve markers of Muslim distinction in the public sphere. One of them, Taqwatul Iman, is more focused on divine sovereignty and these popular practices, and is very critical of them in this very fierce way. The other one is trying to show ways in which a political order, the main function of a political order, is precisely to preserve these markers of Muslim distinction as well. So the tone is very different, the language is very different. One appeals to specialist scholars, the other is intended for the broader public, but they come together in a common sort of argument. And the interesting thing about that argument is that notice how sovereignty or sovereign power is being enshrined in these markers of Muslim distinction, like prayers and fasting and cow sacrifice, for example, according to him and others. So how the choreography of Muslim devotional life in the public sphere again comes to stand in for Muslim sovereign power. So it's not the state that he's after, but preservation of these markers of Muslim distinction. I also look at his letters in Persian and also in Arabic as part of this jihad campaign that he launches with Sayyid Ahmad Barelvī, one of, not to be confused with the Barelvī order, this millenarian mystic scholar and warrior with whom he collaborates and launches this fatal jihad movement against the Sikhs, and gets memorialized for that until today, and dies in Balakot, in what is today Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in Pakistan. So that jihad campaign I also look at quite extensively, and the letters that they exchanged with different rulers in Central Asia, Afghanistan, etc. So that's also a very important part of the intellectual corpus that I look at in this text. And there's another pamphlet called Yak Roza, which is on the whole issue of can God lie or not, which is a fascinating topic, a fascinating text, again in Persian, that I also look at. So my attempt was to really bring Shah Muhammad Ismail in its different complexities and different kinds of registers to the audience in this book. There is still much more to be done on him, especially Sufi writings, but I hope that I've at least begun the process of having a more complex notion of Shah Muhammad Ismail emerge for a Western audience.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. Diverting a little from the topic, the first time I came across your work was, I think, this conversation you were having with Dr. Qasim Zaman about cow slaughter in India, and how you mentioned about it being a marker of Islam, the Shair Islam, how some of the ulama argued that it should be maintained, we should not compromise on the slaughter, but the others were like, for the larger interest we should. So I'm just wondering if we can get the link to that talk. If it's available online, then I would love to put it down in the description for people if they're interested to have a listen to it.
Yeah, I think you're mentioning this Princeton NES talk. I don't think it was recorded, but I think I have given another talk that also talks about this issue. That was for Cambridge University of Cambridge recently. So I'll share that link to you. With you.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I know we're a little short on time, so I'll skip a couple of questions, but one that I majorly wanted to engage with you was about the reforming of religion in the shadow of colonial power, the idea of maslak. And can you explain the term maslak and how these reforms were executed under the shadow of colonial power?
Yeah. So, as I said earlier, that I think the conditions of colonial modernity and colonialism and the British colonial state, especially after the 1857 mutiny, is very critical for the formation of these schools. And one of the things that happens in the late 19th century is that these individual based disagreements and debates between different Muslim scholars, between different individual Muslim scholars like Shah Muhammad Ismail, Fazl Khairabadi, etc., take on a much more group-centered orientation. The Muslim scholars and actually other religious traditions also get divided into different competing groups. And that, of course, happens in the Hindu tradition, the Sikh tradition as well. So one of the things that the book is trying to show and do here is, and that, of course, is what makes this an intellectual history, at least that's what I would aspire it to be, is that it is showing ways in which, as conditions of colonialism are more and more entrenched in South Asia and in North India especially, how that leads to the intensification of an intra-Muslim debate and polemic and takes on a more group-centered orientation. So that in some ways is the larger sort of canvas through which this book is presented, sort of ways in which the entrenchment of colonial power corresponds with the ongoing life of an intra-Muslim debate and polemic, and how they correspond with each other. Hence, the first part of the book begins with shifts in sovereignty, shifts in logics of sovereignty from the Mughal Empire to the British colonial state in the early 19th century. And the second part of the book, chapter 6, starts with this chapter that you're talking about, the reforming religion in the shadow of colonial power. So maslak basically refers to these competing, and the plural is masalik, refers to these competing groups of Muslim scholars. The term itself, of course, comes from the Arabic suluk, or conduct, good conduct, ethical conduct and practice. And maslak, of course, etymologically becomes a place of good conduct. You add the ma next to syllables, that, of course, is the name of a place in Arabic. So the place of good conduct, etc. But in South Asia, I mean, it does take that meaning of good conduct, etc., but it takes on a much more comparative meaning, and it refers to these competing groups of Muslim scholars. What I try to do in chapter 6 of the book is to really try to make this concept as understandable and as effectively understandable for the audience, for the readers, is I describe this term as having three components. And those three components are knowledge, the sources of knowledge, and practice. In fact, Umar, it's been a while since I wrote this. I just want to make sure that I get this right. So this, this is, maslak is knowledge. Yes, knowledge, hermeneutics, and practice is how I call it. That's nicer. So knowledge, hermeneutics, and practice. So basically, the question is, what is authoritative knowledge from the past? What do we consider to be authoritative knowledge? How should one access that knowledge? That's interpretation, hermeneutics. And then what kind of practice emerges from the way you understand knowledge and hermeneutics? So the three major groups of Muslim scholars, Sunni Muslim scholars primarily in South Asia in the late 19th century, are the Deobandis, the Barelvīs, and the Ahl Hadith. These are three major groups of Muslim scholars. So for the Deobandis and Barelvīs, authoritative knowledge, the source of authoritative knowledge, is the same. It's the canon of the Hanafi legal school. I mean, they read it in different ways. Some texts might be emphasized more than others, but it's a common reservoir, a common source of knowledge, the Hanafi legal school, but one of the four major schools of law in Islam, the one that is most dominant in South Asia, the Hanafi legal school, named after the eponymous founder of the school called Abu Hanifa. So knowledge is the same, but where they differ from each other is in the hermeneutics. How should one interpret that knowledge? And then the practice that emerges from it. So how they read sources from the past, how they read sort of luminaries of the Hanafi tradition, how they read these major texts of the Hanafi school, people like Ibn Abidin, this major Damascene scholar, and others, and then what kind of practice emerges from that. The Ahl Hadith, they differ from both the Deobandis and Barelvīs on account that they have a different conception of what is normative knowledge. So for them also, of course, they are very skilled at the legal canon, etc., but they have a much more of an emphasis on the Quran and Hadith as sources of knowledge. And I will admit there can be more nuanced readings of the Ahl Hadith, and there are some younger scholars I've noticed who are doing some very interesting work here, and who are also slightly pushing back against the caricature of Ahl Hadith as these kind of minimalists who are only about the Quran and Hadith. And I appreciate that challenge. I think it can be nuanced, but primarily they do have a certain kind of a focus on the Quran and Hadith, and a critical attitude. Let's call it a critical attitude towards the Hanafi legal canon. So the knowledge base is different. Even though when it comes to practice, they might also be critical of the Mawlid, celebration of the Prophet's birthday, as the Deobandis are. But the very knowledge base is quite different. So, Ashraf Ali Thanvi, for example, uses this interesting analogy that I also have in the book, that, Barelvīs are like members of one's own family who have gone awry, who have become misguided. The Ahl Hadith were never part of the family to begin with. So that's a very sort of interesting and poignant sort of way that he puts it. So oftentimes the debates between Deobandis and between uh, the Barelvis and the Ahle Hadith and the Deobandis and the Ahle Hadith can be even more intense than, say, between Deobandis and Barelvis. But that's a compact way to understand the differences between these three groups and to understand the concept of maslak. It's basically about how one thinks about the relationship between knowledge, hermeneutics or interpretation, and practice. So that those three things, how do they come together, is what defines these different reform movements or masalik in the colonial context.
Well, that's engaging and wonderful. So just a couple questions before we come to the end of the conversation. I'll quickly go up to asking about how important is it for us to approach this work or trying to understand the contestations between these two schools of thoughts, the Deobandi and Barelvi, in these political theologies, for us to understand current political Islam in South
Yeah.
Asia.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I'm trying to show in this book, and in some ways, if we were to really pinpoint in terms of what is the absolute sort of take-home point of this book, what is the one point I would like readers to take from this book, even beyond this argument about competing political theologies, etc., is to rethink the very idea of the political and to think about ways in which these questions of practice, these questions about choreography of the body, these questions about really the senses and the affect, should the location where the Maulid is being celebrated or held be fragranced or not. The food, of course, is very central to these debates, and it keeps coming up repeatedly in this book, especially in the context of this ritual of distributing food to the poor of a neighborhood as a way to transmit the blessings from that act of charity to the soul of the deceased on the 3rd and 40th day of someone's death. So these different kinds of questions and debates that have to do with the body, that have to do with what may seem like very specific and almost arcane, and even for some people petty sort of debates that have nothing to do with conditions of modernity and progress and so on and so forth, that in fact they're deeply political. And they articulate competing conceptions of the relationship between the individual and the social, and competing conceptions of what a moral public ought to look like. So in some ways, I'm, of course, heavily indebted here, and I'm drawing on and I'm trying to further the insight of Professor Sabah Mahmood that she articulated most forcefully in The Politics of Piety, her famous 2004 text, but even in other texts as well, to rethink the question of the political and the category of the political beyond the nation state, beyond electoral democracy, beyond things like voting, etc. So in that way, I would say that in some ways, these actors, many of them did not directly engage with institutions of electoral democracy. They're also engaged in something deeply political. That's one thing that I would say. But on the other hand, even those kinds of scholars and movements we associate more directly with political Islam, like say Jamaat-e-Islami and others, etc., they're also deeply invested ultimately in the curation of a moral public. They're also, of course, ultimately invested in curating a certain kind of a notion of the public that aligns with restoring divine sovereignty. Divine sovereignty is a key category in the thought of Abul Ala Maududi, though he employs it in a very different sense than some of the actors here. Maududi, for example, was deeply enamored with Shah Muhammad Ismail and was deeply influenced and enamored by and inspired by his jihad movement against the Sikhs, that he never considered to have failed, even though people, Shah Muhammad Ismail had died in it and was unsuccessful in dislodging the Sikh, but he considered to be a first important moment in the narrative of South Asian Islam, etc. So there are some interesting interconnections, but what I would say in response to your question is really my main contribution is to rethink the question of the political and to think about these seemingly arcane debates as deeply political and as articulating very sophisticated understandings of the relationship between the individual and the social, and very sophisticated understandings of the relationship between normativity, time and history, which is a theme I was not able to get into in this podcast, but it's there amply in chapters 8 and 9 of the book.
So, I mean, unfortunately, because of constraint of time, we have to come to the end of the podcast. But I really wish. I mean, I think it can go on for another 2 episodes. But I really wish I could have engaged more with the book. If you have time and if you don't mind, there are
Sure,
like
please.
2 more questions that I wanted to
Please,
discuss.
yes, please. I'll be brief.
Um,
I'm sorry, I've been a bit long in my answers.
No, definitely. I completely thoroughly enjoyed your answers. One thing was about how can we understand the boundaries of Muslim tradition? How are they contested in modernity? And the other was also like, like I just want to understand how the ulama, even to this day, kind of hold a certain power over the masses, and the kind of control that they hold over the masses, and
Yeah,
how is that inherently political? Yeah, even in India and Pakistan, how their control over the political ideologies and whom to vote and what to do and political acts of the masses is controlled by the ulama.
yeah,
How does this find its roots in
yeah.
this contestation?
Yeah. I think you've asked a very good question, and it goes right to the heart of the question of what kind of authority do these scholars yield and have yielded in history, in the modern moment, but also in the pre-modern moment. Um, uh, I think, oftentimes when people talk about the ulama, especially in the context of Pakistan, it is often said that their authority is greatly exaggerated because they never are able to win the elections, and elections are always won by non-religious parties, etc. That's a very common kind of trope. I think what that trope misses is precisely that it is limiting the category of the political to electoral democracy and to things like elections, etc. Um, um, Even though I think scholars do yield some interesting influence and authority in that domain and sphere as well. I think the power and authority has to do with the whole desire and anxiety over salvation. So the kind of knowledge that the ulama impart on their pupils, on sort of the masses, is salvational knowledge. Is this whole idea of how to live one's life in a manner that would be conducive to attaining salvation in the afterworld, and to the kind of hyper liberal or hyper secular individual that might seem like a strange desire or anxiety to hold in the modern moment, when seemingly these kinds of conditions and these kinds of questions have been eclipsed by the rational sort of reasoning of modernity. But for many people, for vast number of people, that is not the case. So I think that is in some ways where the authority comes from, this deep sense that salvational knowledge is a domain of discourse that the ulama have some expertise in, that is not shared by other members of society. And it is precisely then to control this domain that becomes a very important part of intra-ulama debates. So the interesting thing about this book is that the two groups of scholars whom I'm talking about are so similar in the broad outlines. They lived in North India, they share a certain common geography, they share the common institutional space of the madrasa. They're both under this new yoke of colonial power. They're both Hanafi in terms of the legal orientation. They're both Sufi masters, albeit of different Sufi paths and schools. But despite that, they engaged in this vigorous and vociferous polemic that we reverberates until today, not only in South Asia, but in diaspora communities around the world, in UK, South Africa, the US, Caribbean, etc. So that is interesting. I think what that shows is that precisely because their clientele were so similar, that this debate became so polemical and so vociferous. And I think it's precisely the question of whose understanding of salvational knowledge gets accepted and is deemed to be credible by the masses. And that's precisely the point that this very intriguing figure, whom I talk about in chapter 12 of the book, Haji Imdadullah Muhajir Makki, the Sufi master of the Deoband pioneers, and Sufi master of many other scholars as well. That, in fact, is the chapter with which the book, in terms of its chronology, began. It ended up being the last chapter, but that's how I began this project. So he tries to bring together these competing groups of scholars, and his main argument is that if you engage in these kinds of polemics, the attitude of the masses towards you can become damaged. And he really was very, very strong in his rebuke of the masses, that you have no business in denigrating scholars of competing schools. This is not your pedigree. So I think it has to do with maintaining a certain kind of a hierarchical organization of society, where it is the ulama who get to dictate how salvational knowledge is to be interpreted and how it is to be manifested in the everyday lives of the community. And that's where the authority also comes from. And that authority becomes much more contested when new forms of knowledge come into the public sphere, modern science and new kinds of rationalities come into the public sphere. And that becomes, of course, very obvious in these debates, ongoing debates about moon sighting during Eid and so on and so forth. So, and the more this domain is contested, the more this domain is sort of contested by outsiders, the more I think the ulama have become much more anxious about preserving this domain. So the interesting thing, the last thing I'll say in response to your question, Omar, is that I think in today's world, it would be very difficult to imagine this kind of an intense but extremely complex, complicated debate among the ulama on this very, very sensitive questions like prophetic intercession or how one should understand the prophet, etc. I think as the domain of knowledge has been more and more contested by outsiders, I think the ulama also have become much more cautious about their internal squabbles and debates. Cautious, but at the same time, sometimes overly violent. Not the ulama, but I think the sort of non-scholarly sort of Muslim clerics, etc., have become perhaps more violent precisely because of that anxiety that we don't get to control this salvational knowledge anymore. So, there's more complexity there, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, before coming to an last 10 questions, just want to note that after I read your book, I just went on YouTube to basically look for videos of these debates, and most of the ones that, like you pointed out, as like fierce Islamic, like Muslim clerics who are probably not like as scholarly as the ulama, debating, sitting in masajids and like arguing on the top of the tones,
Yeah,
throwing accusation of blasphemy on each other, and
yeah.
like nothing civil about or scholarly about those arguments.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I know you want to get to the last question here, but I think that's another thing that I wanted to. I mean, my sort of message for the non-ulama world is to really get into the complexities and to at least, even if you don't agree with their thought, to have some kind of competence, some kind of
Tolerance.
and proficiency in their logics of their argument. But for the ulama, of course, who know much more about the tradition than I ever will, my message also was, or for sort of non-ulama religious sort of clerics, etc., that I think this polemic gives also a great example of an intensely fierce, intensely controversial, intensely sensitive debate that was fought out, but yet no shots were fired. In terms of physical violence, it was, no shots were fired. So I think it gives an interesting example of a complex debate, but yet maintain some etiquette of disagreement.
Yeah, we can agree to that. So my last question to you was like, what is your current work that you might be working on, if
Yeah.
you're working on, and uh, what can we be looking forward to from your work and keep an eyes out on?
Thank you, Omar. So I'm currently in the middle of a book which is tentatively titled The Promise and Peril of Hindu-Muslim Friendship, which looks again at intra-ulama debates and ulama discourses, but on the question of Hindu-Muslim relations and friendship that extends from the late 18th century all the way to the middle of the 20th century. And it's currently it's a 6-chapter book. I'm sort of 80% done with it, so I hope to be done with the first draft by the end of the year, if not before. It basically looks at different topics like Muslim interpretations of Hindu thought and practice, interreligious polemical festivals that were organized by the British, where you had different Hindu and Muslim groups of scholars debate each other on questions like miracles, etc. And then 2 chapters are focused on the Khilafat movement context and debates on Hindu-Muslim friendship that arose because of the collaboration between the protagonists of the Khilafat movement with Gandhi and the Indian National Congress. So this whole debate emerged about Hindu-Muslim friendship. And then there is a chapter on cow sacrifice and cow slaughter and implications of that for Hindu-Muslim friendship. And the last chapter looks at this interesting category in Muslim thought called reprehensible imitation or tashabbuh, and Muslim South Asian Muslim discourses and debates on that. And in that chapter, I'm particularly interested in the kind of genealogy of this very interesting intra-Muslim difference in South Asia between the Deoband school and the Aligarh school, Sayyid Ahmad Khan and the pioneers of Deoband. And the book ends with some contemporary examples with more recent sort of in India and in Pakistan on questions of minority-majority relations, etc. So that is the current book I'm working on and hope to be done with by the first draft, at least by the end of the year.
Oh, I'm keenly looking forward to the engagement with your work. I mean, it's quite interesting, and I'm personally very interested in looking forward for it to come out. So, thank you so much, Dr. Sher Ali, for taking your time and joining us on the podcast. I really appreciate it. And as I told you before, it was a dream come true for me to interview you, and I really hope that I was able to do a good job. I'm really looking forward
Omar,
to learn a lot from
it
you.
was an absolute pleasure to speak with you. And I again want to thank you not only for your time in scheduling and to do this interview, but in doing this very careful reading of this book, which I know is very
Thank you so
time
much.
consuming. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed this conversation. The kind of range of questions that you asked were really enjoyable. And I think you are already a maestro podcaster, podcast
Thank you
interviewer.
so much.
And I really wish all the best for this podcast. And I hope scholars and students of South Asian Studies would listen and will participate in this podcast. It was a true honor to be in conversation with you. Thank you so much, Omar, for your time.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to today's episode. We really hope you enjoyed it. This brings us to the end of today's podcast. If you liked it, please consider subscribing to us on any platform you're listening to us from and share it with your family and friends. Your support means a lot for us. Don't forget to check out our website www.indiacolonized.com, that's colonized with an S, where we have more such interesting articles, blogs, and write ups just for you. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, or any other social media platform to stay tuned with us about latest updates about our episodes and write ups. So until next time, stay safe, stay curious.